Formula One is celebrating its 75th birthday in 2025, and to mark this occasion, this absolute behemoth of a book has been released. It covers every decade of Formula One with some absolutely beautiful photographs from each era. And one of the co-authors has joined me today on the show, Stuart Codling. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Yeah, I've been diving. I did say it's an absolute behemoth, but for the video viewers, I will show it now. It is, there's a lot to it. You definitely get a lot of bang for your buck very much when it comes to getting this one. And it does cover Formula One from the very beginnings, even before F1 was officially codified and all that, to the modern day as well. But yeah, so for those that might not know who you are, Codders, who are you? What are you normally doing? Who do you work for? All that good stuff.
Well, up until recently, I edited GP Racing magazine, formerly F1 Racing, and I currently work for, in theory, I forget what my job title is. Who cares what it says on the contract? But yeah, I make words appear in Autosport magazine and on autosport.com and motorsport.com as well. In theory, different words, but sometimes they're the same words with a different headline. But there will be different words across different websites at some point once I develop the mental bandwidth to work out the difference.
I think a lot of people could probably relate to that sentence. Like, what is my job title? It's not what I actually do. That's pretty common. But yeah, some fairly big publications there. So you've probably seen Codders work in and around the world of Formula One. And if not, of course, do check it out. But yeah, so I think before this book, you'd done one on McLaren and done one on Ferrari, just going over their history of Formula One. What made you kind of branch out and think, you know what? I want to cover everything. I want to do the whole lot, everything.
I'll do the lot. Well, actually, it wasn't my idea. It was my publisher's idea, and it was just after I think we were sort of patting ourselves on the back for a job well done on the McLaren book, and Zach Miller from Motorbooks said, "Well, we should. It's the 75th anniversary next year. We should do a book." So I said, "Okay, yeah." And then he came up with the specs of what the book would be, and at the moment, at the time, sort of towards the beginning of last year, GP racing, we just didn't have that many staff, and I was struggling to take my loo days for working at Grand Prix weekends, let alone actual holidays. So when he said how many words this book would encompass, I said, sadly, I'm just not going to be able to produce that many words and do that amount of picture research and write that many captions in that amount of time. So we need to have a division of labour. And he said, okay, well, James Mann, who you've worked with on the various other picture books I've done, picture books as Ed Straw likes to call them, he'd be good at selecting pictures. Who do you reckon should do the words? And for that, I thought it'd be a good idea to approach James Roberts, who I used to work with on GP Racing, who's now a freelancer. And he'd never done a book before, so he was very excited. And the last time I saw him in Bahrain, he hadn't actually got his box of books because, as well as your contract and a little bit of money, you get, I think, 20 copies of your book to do with as you will. And Jimmy is still at that stage where he's really, really excited by this. But I'm at that stage where I've got a cupboard at home full of books that I don't really know what to do with because I actually got banned from eBay for trying to sell my own books on it. So I filter them out through charity shops and to Ziffit and things like that. So, you remarked on how big this book was. Imagine the look on my wife's face when she arrived home and found enough boxes to accommodate 20 copies of that book on our doorstep.
I doubt it was a good expression, but how did you get? I mean, this is very much a tangent, but how did you get banned on eBay for trying to sell your own book?
I put my own books up for sale, and then half an hour later, I got an email telling me I was a threat to the community. And of course, the thing is, it's all automated. So you reply saying, all I'm doing, I wrote these books.
Yeah.
I've got a cupboard full of them. Why can't I sell them? And you just then get an automated boilerplate reply because that's the thing with eBay, and it's all our future as AI creeps in, is that
Ugh.
we will all be answerable to robots. And when in the words of a now cancelled comedy program, computer says no. That is it.
Basically, yeah, that is incredible. Getting banned for trying to sell your own products. Yeah,
Yeah,
other
I'll
online retailers are available, I guess.
I'm going to get banned from the local Oxfam secondhand bookshop soon. So they'll see me walking through the door and they'll be, Marjorie, it's him again.
Oh, I mean, maybe sign him as something to make him more unique or something. But that is an incredible story right there. But yeah, I mean, I was going to ask how the process of co-authoring with two other people kind of went, but you kind of explain it there, like somebody doing the pictures, somebody doing the writing. Was there any kind of did you kind of set like, right, we're going to talk about this, and this. You need to get pictures for this. Need to write some things on this, or was it kind of a collaborative process where you're like, oh, I really want to talk about this car, though, or this race was really significant, or because you do highlight a lot of like key cars and key drivers and highlight the champions quite a bit as well. How did that all work?
Well, I'd love to say it was that organized, but have you seen the latest Wallace and Gromit film with the robotic gnome that does all the gardening? That was kind of that's what James Mann's like. He's really fast acting. So the minute we'd all signed our contracts, he was emailing me and sending me WhatsApp saying, "Okay, right, what's going to be in this? I'm going on holiday, so I've got to do it now." I said, "Well, let me send you the book outline and what I'll be talking about, and that's kind of going to be about what it's going to be." With the other James, we had a very collaborative process about what we were going to talk about because obviously some of the we didn't really want there to be an overlap. We wanted it to sort of complement the thing. So I had some ideas about what he could possibly do for those sidebars, and then he came back with some sort of counter ideas that were actually kind of better. So he'd been reading the autobiography of Sterling Moss's manager and got that wonderful story of having to yank Alfred Neubauer out of the aeroplane toilet and that sort of thing. So I said, okay, right, drop my idea, do that. That's much better. And then, the pictures naturally followed from that. And when the book was designed, it just goes through several iterations and they sort of do a basic design with stock pictures, and then Zach will go, "Oh, can't you use one of James Mann's studio pictures for that car or that sort of thing?" And that's kind of the way it worked. James had long since done his picture research and his captions and gone off on holiday and come back again by the time I'd written most of it.
Oh, very much a busy bee with that, but hey, it's at least he was eager. That's the main thing there with that. Well, I was going to ask about the pictures as well because they are genuinely beautiful, a lot of them, and a lot of them I haven't seen. And I've spent a very unhealthy amount of time looking up old F1 footage and photos and stuff like that over the years. So you mentioned that James Mann had some himself, his own studio. I mean, how did you go about acquiring these images? I know that motorsport.com, for example, has like a massive archive of old F1 photographs.
Yeah, the previous owner had because we've been sold and the archive has been sold separately. But yeah, the previous owner pretty much bought every motorsport photographic archive under the sun and amalgamated them under the Motorsport Images brand. So that they even had glass plates from the 1930s when we were based at Tennington Studios and it was all part of Haymarket. Uh, the area where Motorsport Images, LAT Images as it was known then, was based, had to have its own halon gas fire extinguishing system because so much of the stuff in there was highly flammable. All these transparencies, like I said, the glass plate images from. I'm sure there was probably metal stuff from when people used box brownies to photograph. Back in the 1910s when you had straight 16 engines going, that sort of nonsense. Uh, they had everything under the sun. James has been photographing cars for probably longer than I've been on this earth. Oh, is he that much older than me? Maybe not. But he's even done a book called How to Photograph Cars. And he does these marvelous studio images. If you look back at some of the other books we've worked on, like Art of the Formula One car, the McLaren and Ferrari books both use his studio imagery. He is amazing. He basically he can either create a studio just in the corner of a room, or he can use a professional photo studio. He uses backdrops, he has reflectors, and he can just wheel cars in. He knows exactly what angle. There's some things he does outside. If you read back issues of GP Racing and have a look at some of the "Now That Was a Car" features that use his imagery, spoilers, not all of those images were taken indoors. Some of them he would do at, say, Goodwood Festival of Speed or the Goodwood Revival, just in the pits, and just have a little shield around them, set up his lights, and then basically, I'm going to use a noun as a verb here, Photoshop in a little bit of black around it to make it look like a studio afterwards. But yeah, most of his stuff, especially for the McLaren book we did together, is done in at least a portable studio. So yeah, the McLaren book, he had essentially moved. He did an artistic residence in the McLaren Technology Centre on that boulevard area that overlooks the lake, set up the studio, and they just wheeled these cars in and wheeled them out.
That is a fantastic way to spend an afternoon. That is making me very jealous that he got to do that. But it certainly seems like someone who is really, really good at what he does. So fair play to him for being able to do that. And like I mentioned, there's a lot in here. Obviously, we're covering the entire history of Formula One. But what are your personal highlights of the book? What are the bits where it was like, you know what, this has to be in. This is something that is so pivotal and so crucial. I mean, there's so many parts you could kind of include in that. But what are your personal highlights, would you say?
Well, the to kind of kick off, I felt that I needed to insure myself against the pedants out there who were going, well, Formula One started before 1950. So you have to cover the Grand Prix era and the previous attempt to start a world championship, which came undone because they kept changing the rules, and who wants to take part in a championship where the rules change all the time?
Yeah, Formula One never does that. The rules never change. No, we've definitely learned from those days, haven't we?
And I wanted to pick up on a lot of the themes that people kind of forget about, because I know, when we discuss doing historic features, particularly for the web, there is because on the web you have so much more granular audience detail than you do in magazines or books. You know what people are looking at, and what we found is that stuff before the 1980s doesn't really engage the mainstream audience. So what I really wanted to do was try and bring those periods alive, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, in a way that people could relate to. And try and make them a little bit more visceral, explain a little bit about the crazy politics at the time, mad stuff like avgas V16 engines that never worked, the weirdness behind the championship being run with Formula 2 cars for 2 years because they announced the new rules package too early. Shades of that in the current V10 madness that they've had put to bed recently. You don't energize people about a rule set that's going to come in 2 or 3 years' time and then sit back and wonder why no one wants to participate in what you've got at the moment or develop new cars for it. So just I was very aware that in covering those decades, the storytelling had to be really bang on. And whenever you do a book that covers history, you do have to balance the storytelling against detail, because obviously some reviewers will want to look for mistakes. They'll want to look for points where they think they know better than the author, but actually the author has decided not to mention what jumper Fangio was wearing when he arrived for first practice at the 1957 German Grand Prix, because most the mainstream audience isn't really interested in that. So yeah, it was an interesting challenge, and that was what I enjoyed most, sort of trying to bring the 50s, 60s, 70s alive, as well as doing the other decades justice and kind of refreshing the storytelling, because those eras are probably a bit more fresh in people's minds, but also you do still get that sort of rose-tinted spectacle aspect where people forget various things that happened, and you have books like this give you an opportunity to surface a few things. I just used another noun as a verb. I've been hanging around with Americans for too long. To bring to the surface little elements of the narrative that maybe have been forgotten about almost.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I think you've touched on that very well there because, when I was first getting into Formula One and looking up old races, you could watch them on the BBC back in those days on the website. And they had them all the way back to when they were regularly covering F1 in the late 70s. But before that, it's, well, there's no TV coverage basically. You might be lucky and find the odd thing here and there, but it's very difficult. The only real way that I learned about races from back then are either books like yours or going on Wikipedia articles, looking up the old race reports, things like that. But a lot of people do kind of skip past that because of that. But F1 back in the 50s and 60s, I mean, I learned something. I didn't know that Formula One ran to F2 spec for a few years. I just
Yeah.
never knew that. I had no idea. But the F1 back in the old days, in really old days, 50s, 60s, it was absolutely wild.
Yeah, the it's crazy, isn't it? The theory at the time was that it was safer to be thrown out of the car if you had a crash than be trapped inside it if it set on fire, which has a certain pervasive logic to it. But just people died all the time because the cars were lethal, and you'd get thrown out. And you look at, say, 1957, 1958, people dying constantly. I think that there's a very good documentary about Ferrari a few years ago that kind of tackles, 1958 and all the people who died,
Mm,
Luigi Musso, Peter Collins, Mike Hawthorne died separately, of course, but and the following January, but still a very, very dangerous era. And I suppose, you get, in many ways, liking Formula One is a little bit like being a fan of Doctor Who, in that your favorite Doctor was the one who was in the role at that period where you were kind of growing up, first getting into it. I'm an old person. It was Tom Baker for me. So there we go. So that's aged me. And
good choice, by the way. But yeah.
very, very good choice. Not towards the end, but that we're going down another rabbit hole there. It's very easy for people to kind of cherry pick an era of Formula One as their favorite. And while researching a previous book, I came across a very interesting piece by the doyen of motoring journalists, Dennis Jenkinson, in Motorsport magazine in the 1970s, and it was headlined "When Did You Lose Interest?" And it was basically a 3 or 4 page rant about the kind of people who would sidle up to him in paddocks and try and sound him out about how much he hated the current era. And he said, the depending on how old the person you speak to is, they have a very different take on when Formula One was ruined. So you get all the people who say, "Oh, it was ruined when tobacco sponsorship came in." "Oh, it was terrible when Nuvolari died," and all that sort of thing. Everyone likes to say that a particular era was great, and it's all been rubbish after that. But I think actually each era has its charms. And if you look at the 1960s, when only 5 or 6 cars were finishing races and several minutes apart, that wasn't exactly great racing. You're probably glad you weren't having to watch it on TV at the time. And of course, at the time, there was very little in the way of TV coverage, because the promoters thought that if it was on TV, people wouldn't pay for tickets. So that's another way in which the modern world has many shortcomings and many crazinesses, but I think we've advanced our thinking beyond there.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it reminds me of a conversation I had with my granddad years and years ago. And, he grew up through the 50s and the 60s. And he always said, no, Formula One was best. But I always said, oh, no, F1 in like the 80s was the best. And he was like, no, the 60s and the 50s, that's where it was at. And I'm like, but didn't loads of them die all the time? He said, yeah, but it was just better back then. And I'm like, I'm looking back on it, I can't ask him anymore because he's no longer with us, unfortunately. But I'm just think, how did you actually watch it though? Because it wasn't on TV. You must have just read about it in the newspaper. Was it just
Uh,
exciting reporting back then? I don't know. I don't know. I can't ask him, unfortunately. But I think you're absolutely correct, because now I've got to the age where when I was first watching F1 late 2000s, people are now looking back on that as like, oh, F1 was so great early 2010s, late 2000s. And I'm like, hang on, I remember everybody and their mother was complaining about F1 being too boring back then. It's
yeah.
it's a thing that always happens, and people are going to be. I mean, people are complaining F1 is boring now, but I tell you, 20 years from now, people will be like, oh, Verstappen, back when he was winning his championships, it was a great time. We'll be saying that in 20 years' time. It's a constantly kind of going cycle, really, this nostalgia.
Well, yeah, the whole bring back V10s madness, which I've written about severally. I've written about it for next month Autosport. I did a piece about it on Autosport and motorsport.com a few weeks ago. Is very much a nostalgia trip for people whose formative experience was the early 2000s. I remember going to races in the early 2000s in a professional capacity. My first F1 race as a journalist was the well, I had to leave before the race, but I'll come back to that. The 2002 Austrian Grand Prix, infamous when I was working on F1 racing. Unfortunately, the junior member of staff, or the most junior member of staff in those days, had to leave on the Sunday morning and take the bag of film because all the photographs were shot on film in those days, transparency film, and some mug had to drive them home and hand them in at the chemist. Well, actually, it was a photo lab, not the local branch of Boots, but they all had to be processed overnight so they'd be ready to use on the Monday morning. And on that weekend, I was that mug. So I was sitting nursing a very large Weiss beer in Graz Airport when my phone buzzed. And it was my then colleague, now FIA press conference MC, Tom Clarkson, saying they're going to swap the cars around. They're going to let Schumacher win. This is an outrage. And I couldn't rightly believe it. And all through that era, I remember, my now wife would fall asleep on the sofa on a Sunday afternoon, and after the race, she would raise her head, ask who won, and if I said Michael Schumacher, she'd go boring, and head would go back down again. There we go. Nap continued. So yeah, that was how it was back then, and when you look at all the many hoops they jumped through to try and make it more interesting, the endless fiddle faddling with the qualifying format, the arguments, and there was this constant sense of inadequacy almost. And there was the tension between people thought that the FIA unfairly supported Ferrari, but actually Max Mosley was kind of doing his utmost to, and probably because, he wouldn't even go to the toilet without Bernie Ecclestone say so. He probably had Bernie in his ear saying, something sort of needs to be done, but not in a way that's too damaging to Ferrari. So this constant rearranging of the deck chairs on the Titanic, it seemed to be, it doesn't stick in my mind as halcyon days. My formative experiences of Formula One were the early to mid 80s, in which Alan Prost and Niki Lauda were winning everything. And there were only two of us in my class at school who watched Formula One. Everyone else said it was boring and stupid and just rich men driving around in circles. So, yeah, it goes on.
Well, definitely. I was one of the very few people in my kind of class who watched F1 as well. And the amount of people now actually that used to say, "Oh, it's boring. Why are you watching that? Why don't you watch football? Why don't you watch a proper sport?" And the amount of people that said that back then that now watch it now, I'm like,
Mm.
I told you. I told you, but it's taken things like Drive to Survive to actually get them into it. But whether they're still watching now, I don't know because a lot of them got into it in 2021, which was an unbelievable season. And
Mm.
we've not quite had the same heights since then. I'm hoping this season will become that. I think it's got potential to. But I mean, what do you think you'll be writing about the 2025 season in future books and publications? How do you see this kind of season playing out? Because it feels like a changing of the guard potentially, but it's very hard to predict as well.
It is nice to see the sort of the Red Bull era of dominance come to a close, isn't it? And it's nice to see, in many ways, the McLaren advantage being, if not wafer thin, because of the car, wafer thin because of the fragility of the drivers at times. So yeah, very interesting. There are so many different storylines in play when you think about just that there's the current competitive order where you think, okay, so McLaren has a car advantage. Will that car advantage be curtailed when the new wing flexibility tests are introduced? Who knows? And of the chasing pack, the situation between Mercedes, Ferrari, and Red Bull is so fluid and track dependent. And up until just last weekend, you would have said that Mercedes had a car that maybe had slightly lower peaks than Ferrari and Red Bull, but accessed what peaks it had a little bit more reliably. They were less all over the place. George Russell notching up a series of podiums. And then, oh, well, in Saudi Arabia, George Russell fell off like John Lithgow at the end of Cliffhanger, didn't he? So it was uh, it's interesting. It's just a shame that when people look at a race and analyze its excitement or lack thereof based on whether the person who won from pole. It's always been a bit problematic to me because you can have a very interesting race going on behind it. It's just a question of whether you see that. And at the moment, we have so much data available to us that you can watch a race unfold. Last weekend, I was doing this Race Centre Live thing, which is another motorsport.com initiative with couple of podcasters who were doing a watch along, and I popped up in the race. And I was there like Mr. Burns in The Simpsons with my many screens because I had them on my laptop, I had the TV on in the background. As always, I have my iPad with the F1 app, which just gives you so much detail. It makes the job of the journalist a lot easier. It's more challenging in some ways, in terms of the information that you have to filter out, but also you just know so much about what's going on. I like to have the driver tracker on with the timing next to it so that I can see the gaps on the circuit. That's something you just never have seen back when I was in short trousers, and it was one very poorly executed feed with not much in the way of timing, and Murray Walker and James Hunt not even necessarily being there. Sometimes they were just watching the same TV footage as you in a cupboard in BBC TV Centre and just trying to make it as entertaining as possible when they didn't have a clue what was going on. Now we just know so much, and you can see all the little battles developing all the way through the field. So it's actually quite rare that I find myself bored during a Grand Prix. I have to say, Japan, I was a little bit, well, this isn't going well, is it? But all the other races recently, just there's always been something to catch the eye.
Yeah, there has been, and it's good that we've got this access to information like this because you are right. It has come on so much, literally in the last few years or so. Like the most kind of information we used to get back in the day was maybe like a red button service where you could go on board with certain drivers, but that really wouldn't tell you anything. That'd probably tell you even less, to be honest, and because you couldn't see the whole race. But it has definitely come on a lot with that for sure. Um, and I feel like Liberty have done a good job with that at the end of the day. You know, they're always advancing the stats and the graphics and everything like that, which is a bit of a double-edged sword. I'm not a huge fan of it, but I do like seeing some of the stuff on there. Um,
Yeah, some of the data is a little bit number wang, I think.
yeah, I do love. No, it wasn't Peep Show. It was Mitchell and Webb Show. It was those two guys. And that's I do get that reference. Yeah, it is very number one. It's just like, oh, 47% chance of an overtake. Yeah, but what's the pit stop like? Has he got DRS? Like, there's too many factors here. Are you counting for that or not? I don't know. You just go with the gaps. That's what usually I do. But yeah, but you mentioned that you were the kind of photography developer in a sense with the junior writer in 2002 in Austria. But how did you kind of get into F1 but in the first place? I mean, how did you get into eventually writing about it and still doing it as your job over 20 years later?
Well, largely by accident, I think, because I went to university doing history and film studies, not really knowing what I was going to do at the end of that. And I was just lucky in that in our first year we lived on campus at the University of Kent, and the guy two doors down on campus was a mature student who was also into F1, so we sort of bonded over that, and he jacked it in and got a job as a journalist at Car Magazine. And we kept in touch over the years, and eventually I I was working on a video game magazine in Bath at the time, the late 90s. Moved from there to that company launched a car and bike magazine, which was fun for a bit until I ended up in a ditch with a Ducati on top of me, which led me to think I should probably be writing about other people's antics rather than doing antics of my own. And right about that time, this guy became editor of F1 Racing. His name was Matt Bishop. We'd kept in touch down the years. Uh, a couple of years later, a job came up. Haymarket were launching a sports car magazine, and Matt said, "Come on, apply for the job. you can write, it'll be easy. So many people that write for these magazines are useless. You can be much better. All you have to do. I won't actually use the Anglo-Saxon word. All you have to do is not be a expletive deleted. So I went to the interview, managed to not be an expletive deleted, and got the job on this sports car racing magazine. It was great fun, and then couple of years later, Formula One came beckoning, and I've sort of been doing it ever since. And I would not disparage the work of other people, but I always try to do the best writing I can and be as engaging as possible. And somehow I've managed to parlay 25, 26, yeah, 26 years now of being in motor racing and writing about motorsport. So someone's buying it. So I'm very, very fortunate.
Well, there you go. Passion's a big part of the end of the day, and obviously, we've been around kind of motorsport for so long and everything. You've got that knowledge too, so
Yeah.
I can see why it's going so well at the end of the day.
Let me tell you that while I was doing batch tests of CD rewriting devices in a attic office in Bath and looking out of a window, watching the tramps fight each other as they did around about 3 o'clock once they'd of an afternoon. I would never have imagined that 28 odd years later I would be writing about motor racing. That seemed a very distant dream at the time, but yeah, you just sort of got to seize your opportunities when they come, I think.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, luck is when preparation meets opportunity. That's what I like to say with stuff like that. I think that definitely applies. Now we've mentioned the upcoming regulation changes. There is still murmurings about V10s coming back in. I've made a video today about that. People are still talking about it. I think one day they may come back potentially, but not for next year. But it does look as though these regulations are finally set in place now for next year. What do you make of them? Do you think that we're going to see a big improvement in racing? Is it going to solve a lot of F1's problems, or is it just kind of changes for change's sake?
Well, I can add a bit of detail about this because in Bahrain, just before that weekend, I'd written a thing about basically that the whole V10 hysteria had come in because people were petrified of the 2026 regulations and it turning into 2014 all over again because Mercedes allegedly has the most advanced engine program. And funnily enough, the FIA's media delegate came over and he's basically Nicholas Tombassis, who's the FIA's head of single seaters, has read your story and wants to put across his side of the story. Is this going to be one of these things where someone just tells me I'm wrong and I have to say, well, you might like to think that, but actually it's right. And we had a 40-minute conversation stroke interview, and at no point did he actually say you were wrong. So he was. It was basically a sort of thing. So we've been doing our best to ensure that that it's as competitive as possible, but obviously it's a scenario where lots of people have been involved in making decisions and compromises have had to be made. So I think, yeah, the headline is that the 50-50 split of internal combustion and the electrical deployment sounded great on paper. It's brought Audi in, it's brought Cadillac stroke General Motors in, and it's stopped Honda heading for the exit. But as we now know, when they first fed in the simulations, it became apparent that at certain circuits, there's not going to be enough electrical harvesting to keep that boost all the way through the lap. And that's even with the cars being compromised in terms of their pace and downforce to be lower drag. Pirelli have been imposed upon to make smaller tires, narrower wheels, all that sort of thing to reduce drag. We've got the active aero, all those things. And even now they're starting to think, it's not going to work. So the F1 Commission yesterday, they were discussing a proposal to shift the balance away from 50-50 in race conditions to sort of something like 64-36 or something like that, something abstract like that. What has been decided is that they're not going to go back to, depends as a hypothetical thing, but they're not going to go back straight away. When the hysteria was first in motion, sort of around it was actually an F1 Commission meeting on the day of the F1 75 launch at the O2. Um, Christian Horner, we're told, had Bernie Ecclestone on speakerphone and put his phone down in the center of the table and said, "Here's Bernie on speakerphone." And the old and cracked voice at the event went, "Here, bring back V10s." And everyone went, "Hurrah!" The oracle has spoken, and it just got out of hand after that because I think it tapped into the manufacturer's fear. The because Christian Horner's paranoid that of being having his team's arse kicked by Mercedes again, and probably rightly so. There was a lot of fear that Mercedes is going to run away with it next year. So it tapped into that. Obviously, there's a nostalgia base in the fan base for those screaming engines of yesteryear. And there's long been a dissatisfaction with the noise the current turbo hybrids make. So it just kind of ran away with itself, which is why in Bahrain they had that meeting and the manufacturers basically agreed that everyone needs to get on the same page because it's all getting a little bit out of control. So we went from a position of some people saying that the 2026 regulations might just be halted and they'll pivot to V10s immediately. That was never going to happen because the manufacturers have spent hundreds of millions of dollars already developing the engines for next year. There's still a possibility that the next rule set may be brought in earlier and may encompass naturally aspirated engines. And in our chat, Tom Bassis was actually very detailed about how much weight could be saved because a naturally aspirated engine would be simpler. It would need to have some electrical augmentation to keep the manufacturers happy. But of course, the world has pivoted a little bit over the past few years when F1, when this package was first mooted, the 2026 package, governments all over the world were steering, is steering the right word? Basically putting car manufacturers in a headlock and saying, you will go full electric by 2030. That now is starting to look like it's softening a little bit because the man in the street doesn't necessarily want to own an electric car. And also sustainable fuels are becoming a possibility. So all that has fed into natural aspirated internal combustion, maybe coming back. It wouldn't be a V12 because they'd be too heavy, too expensive, too complicated. Wouldn't be a V6, ugly firing order, not very efficient. So it would be a V8 or a V10 with electrical augmentation. It would still be possible, and they would have a meaningful weight saving rather than the current slightly meager weight saving of 30 kilos we're looking at next year. Tom Bassis also pointed out that a lot of the weight of the hybrid powertrains is in the cooling, which is why a naturally aspirated one would be lighter. But also, simulations are so much more accurate than they were in the 2000s nowadays that the air inlets are optimized, the radiators are optimized, the air outlets are optimized. There's so much work and expense and weight goes into that in a car now that it's kind of difficult to put the genie back in the bottle, as it were. So that's a challenge that they'll have to come up with. But it is definitely the case that natural aspiration would bring lighter cars. The chances are they would not be revving to 18,000 RPM because they want to have some noise, but they also want to keep the reliability aspect and have engines that last 3 or 4 races. So engines revving to 18, 19, 20,000, that's never going to happen. So it will probably be maybe 16,000. So we won't be going back to that level of noise that we used to get. And what I would suggest people do, because you can see stuff on YouTube nowadays, is go back to some of those races sort of around 2004, I'm thinking 2004, 2005, where the Asiatech engine was in the European Minardi, the former Peugeot thing. And believe you me, when you were watching trackside in that era, you knew when the Toyota was coming past because it was like, "Eow," and then the Asiatech would come past and be like, so if you're getting excited about the return to natural aspiration, have a listen to what the Asiatech engine sounded like, and that's more like where we're at or will be at if it comes back.
Yeah, very well put. I mean, there's a lot of different kind of moving parts with that. I mean, yeah, we're too far down the road now to go back when it comes to, changing the regulations. But it's just Formula One. You know, we got different teams
Yeah.
looking out for their interests and everything, and I remember before 2014, everybody was saying, the cars just they're not going to be able to make the end of the race. Mercedes are going to be the only one that's finishing. And we did see a little bit of that earlier in that season, but the teams got on top of it pretty quickly, aside from Honda. But we won't talk about that. Me being a McLaren fan, those were painful years for sure. But even Honda eventually got it right. So, I feel there's going to be some that get it right and some that get it wrong. We're going to get, a field that is very spread out compared to now. But to be honest, I'm not totally against that because, and I've kind of spoke about this before. I don't know if you would agree with this, but ironically, I think that the reason why the Japanese Grand Prix was so bad to watch anyway was because the cars were too close to one another in terms of their performance. The field spread wasn't there, and it's something that F1 fans are always clamoring for. We want grids that are closer. We want competitive qualifying, competitive race sessions. But when they're that close to one another, when the whole field is within a second and a half, there's not enough advantage there to actually overtake. So ironically, you end up with a worse race.
It's very much a case of be careful what you wish for, isn't it? I think Carlos Sainz said in the pre-Bahrain press conference that for years drivers have been saying we want tyres that we can push on throughout a stint. They've been moaning about the Pirellis being too sensitive. So Pirelli said, okay, fine, we'll make tyres that you can push on through the stint. They brought in the new C1, C2. And lo and behold, here we have in Japan a tyre that people can push on through the stint and no one can overtake one another. And it's like, oh, we need degradation back, which is a sentence you never thought you'd hear.
No, definitely not. And weirdly enough, it ends up going back to the Bridgestone era. It goes back to the Michelin era, where all the overtaking was through the pits or it wasn't happening at all. So it's cyclical. We've seen it before. People need to be really careful what they wish for with stuff like that, I think. But yeah, one last thing I want to kind of touch on, Stuart, is more like, I mean, I've kind of said, kind of asked what people are going to be thinking about the 2025 season in the future, what people are going to be writing about that. But what about the V6 era as a whole? Because it's so strange because we started the year, like I said, a bit under a cloud in terms of people being like, oh, this is going to be the death of F1. These engines sound terrible. And since then, Formula One has exploded to be the fastest growing motorsport in the world, or the fastest growing sport in the world, I think, for a while, may still be. Its global reach has exploded in that time. It's more popular than it's ever been before. The access is even more accessible in terms of everything with the data side of things, like you said, the interviews and all that sort of stuff. Getting race highlights on YouTube. We never used to get that back in the day. That was a pipe dream. I thought that had never happened, but here we are. It's become standard. What are people going to be writing about? Maybe you will be writing about this era in Formula One that is coming to a close this year?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because it's all about context. And when you think that at the end of 2013, Sebastian Vettel had broken the previous record for the most consecutive victories, and I was at the Japan Korea double header in 2013, and just everyone was thoroughly depressed at the inability of anyone else to come close to Red Bull, and they just wanted the season over with. So, would we want to return to that? I'm not sure. Once again, we're in better back then territory, aren't we? And then the following season, that winter, I remember it very well, even though it was many years ago, because there was all that uncertainty. There was the talk that Mercedes had the best powertrain. And I remember going to Caterham to interview their drivers, and I saw not the car, but the tub with the engine in it. And I kind of thought, God, that just kind of looks like a JCB digger, not a racing car. And I was a little bit disquieted at that. And then I went to the Australian Grand Prix that year. I hadn't been to testing. And that was my first experience of hearing the engines. And what does it make it? I said it sounded like someone was vacuum cleaning the inside of their car rather than actually revving the engine. That was what it sounded to me. I could hear the whoosh of the turbo and nothing else. I thought, well, this is never going to cut it. And yet, strangely, it did. We do. It's fear of the unknown, isn't it? How people will look at this era, tricky, isn't it? Because you had so many years of Mercedes dominance. How much of that was through powertrain? Who knows? There are people who say that the first Mercedes car wasn't the fastest on the grid. It just had the best engine. We won't know unless you were able to shoehorn a different engine in. So there's still unknowns. Whether they're Rumsfeldian known unknowns or unknown knowns, who knows? but I think it was worth doing because at the time there was this feeling that F1 needed to embrace electrification because that's how the road car industry was going. I think the problem is that F1 development moves a lot faster than road car development does because in road cars, you sort of they'll be designing cars now that aren't going to be out for another 4 or 5 years, whereas they're now designing Formula One cars that will be in the simulator at the back end of this year and on track next January, February. It just works so much faster. And I think sometimes that the road car industry acts as a bit of a ball and chain around Formula One's leg. It's connected to them and doesn't always enjoy a benefit from being connected to them. Obviously, it enjoys the financial aspects, but there's a lot of negatives as well. But it just has to live with them because that's life. You can't slice it up and have all the good stuff and not have any of the bad stuff. If you need to have the participation of manufacturers, you just have to wear the fact that those road car manufacturers need to sell cars to people, and there has to be some sort of synergy between what they see on Sunday and what they buy on Monday.
Yeah, no, very well put. It's an interesting era, and time will tell what it's very much like. I mean, yeah, it was coming in under a cloud basically after 2013. It was not the best season, but 2012 was one of the all-time greats. So things can very much go in peaks and troughs very, very quickly. But yeah, I mean, we've kind of mentioned the book. We've mentioned where we can see your writing and everything like that. But where can you get the book?
Well, I would say order it at your local independent bookstore because they should be kept in business. Obviously, it's very easy to buy it from a certain well-known online retailer and it would arrive the next day. But firstly, they absolutely screw my publishers down on discounts, and that is irksome because at the end of the day, they're screwing their customers and the people who sell on their platform just so the boss can blast himself and his chums into space. So I would say sod them, order it from your local bookstore.
Very well put. And when is it out?
15th of May was more or less the time of the British Grand Prix, which one of my favourite facts of the first World Championship Grand Prix is that petrol was rationed in Britain at the
Yeah.
time. So if you wanted to go and watch this motor race where they were burning, it was gallons per mile, you would have had to have thunder lift or gone to your local spiv for a tank full of illegal fuel.
God, you gotta love the old days of F1 for stuff like that. I mean, yeah, you even touch on things like drivers going into the harbour and there being a massive tidal wave at Monaco that caused chaos back in the day. It was wild. It was wild, and you can discover all about it in this book. I mean, yeah, it very much. If you've never looked into the history of Formula One before, I think it does do a very good summary of the old days in particular, the times that we don't really see much of. And the only way to really do it is to read about it in something like this.
Yeah, unless you have a burning urge to know what jumper Juan Manuel Fangio was wearing when he walked into the paddock for practice in the 1957 German Grand Prix, in which case you need to buy another book.
That information is out there somewhere, I'm sure. If I'm not mistaken, that's one of his best wins, actually, German Grand Prix that
Mm.
year. But yeah, maybe the jumper made a difference. Who knows?
Kept him nice and insulated for that, the fickle weather you get in that part of the world.
Yeah, absolutely. He's South American. He would have had to keep warm and everything. So it all makes sense. But yeah, thank you so much for joining us on this interview, Codders. It's been a pleasure interviewing you.
Thank you for having me. I love talking about Formula One as well as writing about it. So always a joy.
Absolutely, yeah. And like I said, do check out his other work as well. He's got some other books out too. I do have the McLaren one back there somewhere as well. It's a great read. I'll probably have to pick up the Ferrari one at some point as well. But yeah, thanks for joining us on the show. And yeah, guys, let us know in the comments who you want to see next. Any suggestions are very much welcome. We're more than happy to reach out to them at any point and see if we can get an interview. But yeah, have a great day wherever you are. See you very soon.